Welcome everyone to the Monday edition of our Packers News live chat alongside Pete Dougherty. I am Olivia Reiner. It's the most wonderful time of the year, and everyone, we are just a few days away from the 2021 NFL Draft. Today we're going to discuss General Manager Brian Gutekunst's press conference and get you all up to speed on what his thoughts are heading into this year's draft. Plus, we'll also take a look at a couple of the Packers' greatest areas of need in this year's draft. Before we get into any of that, you know the drill. You can be a part of our conversation. If you're over on Facebook, Periscope, YouTube, leave us a question down in the chat. Pete and I want to hear from you. We'll get to some of your thoughts toward the end of our conversation today. Before we can get into any of the draft discussion, we have to discuss the elephant in the room: quarterback Aaron Rodgers' contract. Rodgers has said multiple times to the media that he feels like his question is a little bit in question. His future is just because the Packers drafted quarterback Jordan Love in the first round last year. So Rodgers we don't know exactly what he is looking for. It's speculated right now that he might want some more guaranteed money because he has no more guaranteed money in the last 2 years of his contract. Today, General Manager Brian Gutekunst said that, hey, Rodgers is our guy for the foreseeable future. Where do the Packers stand right now with Aaron Rodgers?
Yeah, really, there wasn't much to glean from this. I mean, foreseeable future could mean whatever you want it to mean. Gutekunst did make it sound like when he was talking about restructures that they're still, I think they only have, about $2 million in cap room. When they do the draft, they'll still probably just be under the cap because only the top 51 players count. So any new player making the top 51 replaces an old player, but only in the difference in their cap numbers. But come the start of the regular season, after final cuts, you got 53 players. You're going to have probably a couple guys on IR, at least a couple guys. You got a practice squad. Have they set the number for that? 14 players, 16, whatever it ends up being. So they're going to need more cap room for the season. And Gutekunst made it sound like they're still going to have to make some moves, cap moves, with at least a couple players, and said, including possibly Rodgers, basically was the way he put it. So there's still a restructure in play there, but my guess is it'll be a really modest one because I think they could do it if they just basically restructured almost his entire salary. They could pick up like $14 million in cap room still. My interpretation of it was they could end up doing something with him still, but it would be a pretty modest, I don't know, $3 to $6 million cap clearing kind of thing. That's the way I interpreted it anyway.
Gutekunst hasn't touched Rodgers' contract yet. However, he has been very busy this free agency throughout the offseason. He's been very aggressive, not necessarily in trying to go after outside free agents. However, he has been aggressive in trying to retain his own. That being said, the Packers still have plenty of needs along the offensive line and the defensive line, for example. How does this year's free agency and the activity that the Packers have had so far impact Gutekunst's draft philosophy in just a few days?
Well, it sure helps with, and you see other teams do this too, but it sure helps with, there's not a position they got to draft somebody. Like the year they took Savage, you kind of knew they had to take a safety fairly high because they needed somebody to come in and start at that position. There's no position where they have to have a guy come in and start. And when I look at their depth chart, I mean, I see needs galore. Not overwhelming needs, but like they need almost everything, either for depth this year or for future starters. So yeah, you mentioned both lines. They've got to be way up on the list. Corner, wide receiver, inside linebacker. I think all five of those positions are very much in play in the first round. Even edge rusher, you can't completely discount because, is there such a thing as having too many of them? I think it's probably unlikely, but you can't completely discount it. You throw out running back, throw out tight end, throw out quarterback, and the specialists, everything else is really fair game, I think, for the first round.
Let's take a look at some of the positions that the Packers could address early on, including a fan favorite, wide receiver. The Packers didn't use any of their 9 draft picks in 2020 on a wide receiver, and it didn't really affect them last season. They were still the #1 scoring offense in the league last year. However, if you look ahead to not necessarily this season, but next season, 2022, the Packers are in a little bit of a bind in their wide receivers room. Devante Adams, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Equanimeous St. Brown, and Devin Funchess are all slated to become free agents. That being said, Pete, it's not a question of whether or not the Packers are going to take a wide receiver in this year's draft. It is when. Where in the draft this year can the Packers find another wide receiver?
They're all over the place, but history kind of shows the last few years that second round is almost as good a chance as first round at finding a good one. So I would just kind of guessing. I mean, we mentioned those 5 positions. The first 3 picks could be from any of those 5. I'm kind of thinking maybe a receiver earlier and then a receiver later. As you mentioned, next year is the year where they're really going to need it. But receiver is a position where, even though it's accelerating faster now with guys contributing, it's still more that second year than the first year. So looking forward to 2022, if they drafted 2 receivers this year, that would be 2 guys who would, be a farther along next year to play bigger roles. So yeah, I could see two receivers. I mean, but I could also see 2 corners, and I could see 2 offensive linemen in the draft. Not early for both picks, but one early, one late.
Speaking of offensive linemen, yes, that is absolutely a need that the Packers have in this year's draft. Center Corey Linsley departed through free agency to the Los Angeles Chargers. He was a starter last year, and he is gone. Left tackle David Bakhtiari is dealing with an ACL tear. He's still going through rehab. General manager Brian Gutekunst said today that Bakhtiari is ahead of schedule. However, we don't know what that means, and we don't know if he's going to be available to start Week 1. With those offensive line needs in various places, both at tackle and at center, which positions might the Packers be targeting in this year's draft?
They could be looking at any of them because they've got openings, and with the flexibility of some of their guys, especially Elton Jenkins and Billy Turner, whatever position they take, they can have one of those guys play another position. So if they drafted a center, then Jenkins could play guard or right tackle. We can go through the whole thing. For as far as Bakhtiari goes, I talked to a team doctor for another team a few weeks ago on this, and also observing the Packers now for however many years. Mackenzie's been their orthopedist. I just don't see much chance of Bakhtiari coming back before 9 months. One of the big things is you can get the muscle strong, and there's a lot, in the leg. You can do a lot of things in the first 6 or 7 months. But one of the things that has to happen is the new ACL has to, all the neurons have to form because they're forming out of nowhere. They just form by themselves. And that has all to do with your body's spatial awareness, doing movements and all that. And there's no way to accelerate that process. And that's what happens from months 7 to 9. And really, it's not completed till 12 months. And there's just no way to speed that up. So if you go 9 months, Bakhtiari got hurt late December. 9 months gets you to, late September? So I have trouble seeing him playing earlier than maybe the 3rd or 4th game, and it could be the first half of the season he misses. So, they're going to need another starting tackle for at least some of the season. So a long way of saying I think tackle would be the position they'd prefer to draft at. But, you can't force things. You take what's available. But I could see a tackle for sure in the first 2 or 3 rounds. I think there's a pretty decent chance of that.
What do you think, Packers fans? Do you think that the Packers are going to be looking for an offensive lineman, multiple offensive linemen in this year's draft? Let us know below. Let's start taking a look at some of your questions over on Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a little long since we've last spoken to some of you, so let's get right to these questions. We'll start with Brett over on YouTube. Brett wants to know, what are some defensive linemen that you could see the Packers drafting if they get the chance? The defensive line room currently is a little bit thin. Montravius Adams departed in free agency, and besides defensive tackle Kenny Clark, who is the clear marquee player in the Packers defensive line room, there's not a ton of other impact players yet in that room. Kingsley Keke is likely to take yet another step in year 3 in this defense. However, it is yet to be seen. We'll find out. How likely is it that the Packers will target a defensive lineman at some point in this year's draft?
I mean, they got it. I would think they would take one at some point. That's got to be in play in the first round. The two possibilities are Barmore of Alabama, and I want to say it really slowly, but now I need to see it's spelled out in front of me. But the player from Washington, you're a great pronouncer. Can you get that off the cuff here?
It's Levi Onwuzurike.
Those appear to be the only viable. Different teams see things differently, but it looks like those are the only two viable late first round guys. So I think they're at least in play, for number 29 overall. And the Packers surely have looked really closely at these guys. So you're looking for names. Those are the two names that most come to mind. And, there's probably 2 or 3 guys who will get picked anywhere from second or third round, and you can go all the way to the 7th round. There's somewhere in there, there's going to be 2 or 3 guys that end up being pretty good players. But nobody knows who they are, or they'd be getting drafted a lot higher than, say, the 4th or 5th round. So, we won't know the answer for probably a couple of years.
Thank you, Brett, for your question. Let's take a question now over on Facebook from Zach. Zach wants to know, when is a Devante Adams extension getting done? We already mentioned that Adams becomes a free agent in 2022. However, the Packers are likely to come to an extension with him at some point. When is that deal likely to get done?
I don't know. I still think I've got to think they're going to do it. I just find it hard to believe they would let that good a player walk. You never know what they're thinking, but I just find it hard to believe. I listened to your podcast with Tom Silverstein last week, or early this, I guess it was last week. And, he made a good point. You're talking an enormous amount of money here. And so Adams might be asking for the moon right now, and they might just be waiting him out because they don't need to do it right now. And one thing that I always think about on this is, let's say it's a $30 million signing bonus. Well, right now that money is either sitting in a bank account or in an investment for the Packers. And when you talk about that much money, if you wait 2 or 3 months, you're talking real money with the either interest income or investment income you could make of that. That's real money that they could be adding. So, they're just really happy waiting him out. I like Tom and you discussed. It'd be really surprising to me if they let this guy walk. He's just such a good player. But there isn't a need to do it right now. They don't need the cap money right now. They've obviously made all the major moves they're going to make in free agency. So, theoretically, this could be anywhere from between now and, really even the start of the season. Kenny Clark, remember, he did his really early in camp, and that's not unusual for them to do a contract like this in camp. I'm thinking they'd do it earlier, but I kind of assumed because they wanted the cap room, I just assumed it would have been done, several weeks ago. So
what do I say, Packers fans? Always on our live streams, patience is the name of the game. We will see if and when the Packers decide to re-sign and extend wide receiver Devante Adams. Thank you so much, Zach, for your question. Let's take a question here from Dan. This is a pretty broad question, so we can go in a number of ways with this, Pete. Who are the Packers getting in the draft that can help the defense? We've already discussed defensive line. Another position that we haven't yet hit on is cornerback or even inside linebacker. Those are 2 big positions in the Packers defense. Looking at cornerback this offseason, the Packers brought back unrestricted free agent Kevin King, signed him to a 1-year deal and gave him a pretty good amount of money, $5 million. It's clear that they think he is capable of being a starter in 2021 if he is able to stay healthy. Where does cornerback and linebacker rank in the Packers' needs in this year's draft?
Both fairly high. Corners, the thing with corners is you need 3, you really need 4 pretty good ones because you're in dime, and you kind of need 5 because you're always going to have injuries. And so you don't want to be caught with a weak link out there. So I think they really lack depth at that position. So I think cornerback is a really, inside linebacker, I kind of like Martin and Barnes. I think they're decent players and they're really young. So there should be some growth there. Now, if they can find somebody who's really explosive, then that changes things because, today's football, that really helps to have a super explosive guy playing in the middle of your defense. But short of that, for a marginal upgrade, I don't know that I would use a high draft pick for just a small upgrade there. So you do have a couple of guys. You got, Collins from Tulsa, although I think both him and Davis are probably going to be gone, the Kentucky inside linebacker. And if that's the case, then I don't know that they would take an inside linebacker in the first round. I could see either one of those two guys being real good candidates. And corner, that's the same thing. It could be kind of wiped out. I think Newsome from your alma mater, I don't think he's going to make it to 29 from what I'm hearing. And I'm not sure, Samuel is small. He's below the Mendoza line that they have for corners. They made an exception for Alexander, and that worked out great, but I'm not sure. I have my doubts whether they'd make an exception for two guys. I don't think they want to get in the habit of making these exceptions, especially at any particular position group. So I don't know. Farley, I don't think he's going to, even with the back injury, he'll be there at 29. So with Gutekunst, he wants to trade up, it seems like, and he even talked about how attractive that is. He talked about that today. But I kind of wonder if this is a good draft to trade down into the early second round, pick up an extra pick, and then if nothing else, you can use that pick to move back up in the second or third rounds to pick somebody who you thought was a cut above everybody else on the board and who you really liked.
That's a good point, Pete, and this kind of builds off of a question here from Andrew. Andrew wants to know if we think that cornerback is the second deepest position group behind wide receiver in this year's draft. Andrew would argue, yes, that is the case. If you look at some of the names that are projected to get drafted in the second round in the cornerbacks group, you already mentioned Asante Samuel Jr. out of Florida State. There's also players like Elijah Molden out of Washington. He is projected to go in the second round as well. Eric Stokes out of Georgia. Those are just a few names of several cornerbacks that are slated to go in the second round. What makes more sense for the Packers, to take a cornerback in the first round or to look in the second and third rounds for their ideal player?
Judging by the way it looks like the board might fall, I wonder if they're better off waiting. Now, the thing with corners is it's a premium position. The premium positions are quarterback, tackle, pass rusher, cornerback, and then receiver would probably come after that. It's just hard to find really good corners. And the one thing, and the one thing that we've learned, especially, we learned it with Thompson and, we saw it with Wolf too, but especially with Gutekunst, beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. Last year with Dillon in the second round and DeGuara in the third round, you didn't see those guys' names up there for being that high of picks if you read through all the media stuff leading up to the draft. But that doesn't matter to the teams. And if they like a guy, that you talk to scouts and say, hey, if you like the guy, pick him. And so you never know which one of these guys the Packers might think is a lot better than a lot of other teams think, and that they just have a really good feeling about. So, your guess is as good as mine. Just, I don't know, sit there and pick at 29. Maybe that's what he ends up doing that for the first time now that we're in his fourth draft.
You got to put your general manager hat on today, Pete, in a USA Today Network mock draft that went earlier. I have a couple questions here that relate to your selection, so let's take a look. Thank you, Andrew, for your question. Jim wants to know if the Packers go defense in round one, and then Mike points out that the Packers never really pick offensive line till the fourth and fifth rounds, and it has worked out well so far. The first round should be a real inside linebacker that can stop the run. Pete, in the mock draft that you did this morning, you selected Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah out of Notre Dame, and a linebacker. He may or may not actually be there when the Packers go to select at number 29, if they select at number 29. He just happened to fall to you in this particular mock draft. How realistic of a selection is it that the Packers would choose him, or they would choose another inside linebacker in the first round of this year's draft?
It was not realistic. I talked to a scout this morning, and right after that draft, as a matter of fact, and I was asking him. I went through a list of about 15 guys on, will they be there at 29? Yes, no, maybe. He had a couple different areas there, and when I brought up him, couldn't have come out of his mouth fast enough. So it sure sounds like there's just no chance he's going to be there at 29. So no, I don't think that's likely. A better chance that Collins would be there, or the guy from Kentucky, Davis. Better chance one of those two guys would be there. But if I had to bet, I'd still bet less likely than more likely. But maybe they like one of those guys. Maybe, for instance, Davis they think is so explosive. If he's still on the board at 25 or 6, maybe they trade their compensatory 4th-round pick and go up and get him.
It's a good question. Thank you so much, Mike, as well as Jim, for your thoughtful questions. And thank all of you for joining us tonight. We will be back later this week to continue to prepare you for the very first night of the draft. Thursday will also be live after every single day of the draft. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Keep it locked on Packers News. We promise to continue to update you and bring you the latest out of the team. So for Pete, I'm Olivia. We will see you next time.